The restaurant was buzzing with the low hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china. It was one of those places where the napkins were made of thick cloth and the water glasses were always full, no matter how many times you took a sip. For most of the people sitting at the tables, this was just a normal Friday evening. They were dressed in expensive suits and shiny jewelry, talking about business deals or vacations. But for Nancy, the woman weaving through the tables with a heavy tray, this was just another long shift at the end of a very long week. Nancy was 54 years old, though the lines around her eyes made her look a little older, especially when she was tired. She wore the standard black uniform that all the servers had to wear, and her feet were throbbing inside her sensible black shoes. She had been on her feet for 6 hours straight, carrying heavy plates and forcing a smile for customers who barely looked at her. Her back ached, and her mind was constantly racing, doing the math of her life. If she worked this shift and the double shift tomorrow, she might have enough to cover the electric bill and maybe put a little bit aside for her grandson's birthday present next month. It was a treadmill that never stopped, and she was tired of running. She moved through the main dining hall with a practiced efficiency, dodging a waiter carrying a tray of steaming lobsters and slipping past a table of loud businessmen. She was good at her job, even if she didn't like it very much. She knew how to pour wine without spilling a drop and how to disappear just when the customers wanted to be alone. But tonight, her heart wasn't really in it. Tonight, she felt the weight of her years pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She arrived at table 12 to drop off the check. It was occupied by a single man, a younger guy who looked like he owned the place. He had that look, relaxed, confident, wearing a watch that probably cost more than Nancy's car. He was sipping an espresso and looking around the room, observing everything with quiet, sharp eyes. His name was David. He was a regular here, known for being polite but also known for being very observant. He wasn't just eating his dinner, he was watching the people who brought it to him. "Here is your bill, sir," Nancy said, her voice soft but clear. She placed the leather folder gently on the table, keeping her eyes low. She had learned a long time ago that keeping your eyes low meant less trouble. David looked up at her. "Thank you, Nancy," he said. He was one of the few customers who actually bothered to read the name tag. "How are you doing this evening? You look a little tired." Nancy paused for a second, surprised by the question. Most customers asked for more water or complained about the temperature of the soup. They didn't ask how she was doing. She quickly fixed her face into the mask she wore for work. "I'm all right, sir. Just a busy night. Can I get you anything else, perhaps some more coffee?" David shook his head slowly. He didn't reach for the bill. He kept looking at her, studying her face. He noticed the way her hands rested on the table, rough and red from years of work in hot kitchens and busy dining rooms. He noticed the slight slump in her shoulders, the posture of someone who has been carrying burdens for too long. But mostly, he noticed where her eyes kept going. Every time she thought he wasn't looking, or whenever there was a lull in the conversation nearby, Nancy's gaze would drift away from the table. It would travel across the room, past the bustling waiters and the laughing couples, until it landed in the corner. In the far corner of the restaurant, bathed in a soft, golden light, sat a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, black and shiny, looking like a sleeping beast. It was a centerpiece of the restaurant, usually played by a young man in a tuxedo during the dinner rush. But right now, the player was on a break, and the piano sat silent. Nancy looked at it with a hunger that made her look almost like a different person. It wasn't just a glance of appreciation. It was a look of deep, painful longing. It was the look of someone seeing a lost love, or a ghost from the past. When she looked at the piano, the tiredness in her eyes seemed to fade for a split second, replaced by a spark of something bright and alive. But then she would catch herself, shake her head slightly, and look back down at her shoes, reminding herself that she was just a waitress with a tray full of dirty dishes. David followed her gaze. He looked at the empty piano, and then he looked back at Nancy. He saw her take a deep breath and straighten her apron, preparing to head back to the kitchen. He saw the resignation in her face, the acceptance of her reality. And he saw the lie she was telling herself. "You play, don't you?" David asked suddenly. Nancy froze. She had already taken a step away from the table, but his words stopped her in her tracks. She turned back around slowly, her face flushing a little. I'm sorry, sir." "The piano," David said, nodding his head toward the corner. "You play. I've been watching you. Every time you walk past it, you look at it like you're leaving a piece of yourself behind." Nancy let out a short, nervous laugh. She waved her hand dismissively, trying to brush it off. "Oh, no, sir. I don't know what you're talking about. It's just a nice instrument. It breaks up the room, that's all." She turned to leave again, but she could feel his eyes on her back. She felt a strange mix of embarrassment and irritation. She didn't want to talk about the piano. Talking about it made the ache in her chest worse. It reminded her of late nights in her mother's living room, of dreams she had packed away in boxes when she realized that dreams didn't pay the rent. She had learned to stop looking at the piano, for the most part, but sometimes, especially when she was exhausted like tonight, her eyes would betray her. David signaled for the check, but he didn't put his card away immediately. He watched Nancy walk toward the service station. He saw her dump a basket of breadsticks into a bin and wipe her hands on her apron. He saw a woman who had worked hard her whole life, a woman who had probably sacrificed a lot for the people she loved. He also saw a woman who had a fire inside her that she had let go cold. David didn't like seeing wasted potential. It bothered him. He believed that everyone had a gift, and hiding a gift like that was almost a crime. The restaurant was noisy, but in that corner, near table 12, there was a feeling of anticipation. David sipped the last of his coffee, an idea forming in his mind. It was a crazy idea, maybe even a rude one. He knew he was stepping over a line. He knew that servers were there to serve, not to be interrogated by bored millionaires. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at a sleeping giant. He wanted to wake it up. He wanted to know if the music he saw in her eyes was real, or if it was just a trick of the light. He watched her walk back toward the kitchen doors. She looked so small against the backdrop of the expensive dining room, just a black and white figure in a crowd of color. She looked invisible. David decided he didn't want her to be invisible anymore. He wanted to see what happened when the music took over. He wanted to see the waitress disappear and the artist emerge. He set the cup down with a decisive clink. He wasn't going to let her walk away without knowing the truth. Nancy tried to busy herself with wiping down a nearby counter, hoping that the man at table 12 would just pay his bill and leave. She rubbed a cloth over a spot that wasn't even there, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She hated being seen like that. For years, she had perfected the art of being invisible. She was the person who poured the coffee, cleared the plates, and vanished into the background. But that man, David, had looked right through her uniform and seen something she hadn't acknowledged in decades. It made her feel exposed, like a secret she thought she had buried was suddenly dug up and laying in the open for everyone to stare at. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her apron, and forced herself to walk back to the table. She had to be professional. She had to get him to sign the receipt so she could move on to her next task. She put her polite customer service mask back on, the one that didn't show any emotion. "Is everything all right with the check, sir?" Nancy asked, standing a respectful distance away. She kept her eyes on the silverware, refusing to look at the piano in the corner. David didn't pick up the pen. Instead, he swiveled his chair slightly so he was facing her directly. He had a calm, easy demeanor about him, like a man who was used to getting what he wanted but usually tried to be nice about it. He looked at her hands, rough and red from the hot dishwater, and then up to her face. "I know I'm meddling," David said, his voice low and friendly. "And I apologize if I'm making you uncomfortable. But I have a good ear for these things. I noticed the way you looked at that instrument. You don't look at a piece of furniture like that unless you know the language it speaks." Nancy felt her face get hot. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She wanted to deny it again, to tell him he was imagining things, but something in his honest gaze stopped her. It was the look of someone who was genuinely curious, not someone making fun of her. The kitchen door swung open behind her with a loud bang, making her jump, but she didn't turn around. I used to play," Nancy admitted quietly. Her voice sounded small in the large, noisy room. "A long time ago. Before I started working, before the kids, before life got in the way." David smiled, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "That's what I thought. You can usually tell the ones who have the music in them. It never really leaves, you know, it just gets quiet." "Well, it's been quiet for about 30 years in my case," Nancy said, trying to laugh it off. "My fingers are stiff now. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Besides, I'm on the clock. I can't just go sit down at a customer's piano." She turned to walk away again, eager to escape the conversation. Talking about the past made her chest ache. It reminded her of her mother's old upright piano, the one that had a sticky key in the middle register. She remembered sitting there for hours as a teenager, playing until her fingers hurt, dreaming of playing in big concert halls. But life had a way of trampling dreams. Her father got sick, the bills piled up, and she had to take whatever job she could find to help the family. The piano was sold to pay for a funeral. The music was replaced by the sound of cash registers and dishes clattering. "Wait," David said. He wasn't shouting, but his voice was firm enough to make her stop. He reached into the pocket of his expensive suit jacket and pulled out his wallet. "Here is the thing," David said, placing a $100 bill on top of the receipt folder. "I have a theory. I think people are at their best when they are doing what they love, not what they have to do. And I think you're hiding a light under a bushel, as they say." Nancy looked at the money, and then back at him, confused. "Sir, I can't take a tip just for talking to you." "That's not right." "That is not a tip," David said, pushing the bill toward her. "That is a fee. I am hiring you for a specific job, just for a few minutes." He pulled out another 100, and then another, until there were 5 crisp bills sitting on the white tablecloth. $500. It was more than Nancy made in a week, sometimes 2. She stared at it, her mouth slightly open. It was an absurd amount of money for someone like her. What job?" Nancy stammered. "I want you to go over to that piano," David said, pointing to the shiny black instrument in the corner. "And I want you to play one song. Just one. It doesn't matter if it's not perfect. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake. I just want to hear it. I'm paying you to play for me." The room around them seemed to spin for a second. Nancy shook her head vigorously. "Oh, no. No, no, no. I can't do that. Look at this place. Everyone is dressed up. They are eating their dinners. I can't just go over there and start banging away. I'll make a fool of myself. My manager will fire me." "Your manager won't fire you," David said confidently. "In fact, I'll go talk to him right now if you say yes. I'll make sure he knows it's on my request. And as for the people..." He glanced around the room at the diners. "Most of them are too busy looking at their phones or talking about themselves to notice. But the ones who do notice, they will thank you for it. Trust me." "It's not about the money," Nancy lied. She was terrified. The thought of sitting at that grand piano terrified her more than losing her job. It felt like stepping off a cliff. She had spent so many years building walls around her artistic side, telling herself she wasn't good enough, that she was just a worker bee. To break that wall down now, in front of strangers, felt impossible. "I'm rusty. I'm terrible. You'll be disappointed." "I doubt that," David said softly. "But even if you are terrible, it's still worth $500 to me to see someone try. To see someone take a chance. Come on. What do you have to lose? A few minutes of time in exchange, you get a nice tip and a chance to remember who you used to be." Nancy looked at the bills again. She thought about the electric bill sitting on her kitchen counter at home. She thought about the tires on her car that were balding and needed to be replaced before winter. $500 would solve so many problems. But it wasn't just the money. It was the way he was looking at her. He wasn't looking at her like a waitress. He was looking at her like an artist. He saw value in her that she had forgotten was there. The music in her heart, which had been reduced to a faint whisper for 30 years, suddenly beat a little louder. She remembered the feeling of the keys under her fingers, the vibration of the strings, the way the music would take her away from everything. She missed it with a physical pain that made her want to cry. "Just one song," she whispered, almost to herself. "Just one," David confirmed. He leaned back, looking satisfied. "Whatever you want. Whatever makes you happy." Nancy looked toward the kitchen, where her manager was busy shouting orders at a busboy. She looked at the diners, laughing and eating. Then, she looked at the piano. It sat there in the golden light, waiting. It looked scary, but it also looked beautiful. She felt a strange sensation in her stomach, a mix of fear and excitement that she hadn't felt in decades. It was the feeling of being alive. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. She reached out and pulled the $500 bills off the table, folding them and shoving them deep into her apron pocket. It felt like she was making a deal with the devil, or maybe with an angel. "Okay," Nancy said, her voice shaking. "One song. But don't blame me if it sounds like a cat walking on the keys." David grinned broadly and stood up from his chair. "I have a feeling it's going to sound a lot better than that. I'll go handle the manager. You go get ready." Nancy watched as David walked confidently toward the front of the house to speak to the manager. She stood there for a moment, her legs feeling like jelly. She untied her apron strings at the back, feeling the sudden release of pressure around her waist. It felt like she was shedding a skin. She pulled the apron off and draped it over a chair near the service station. Underneath, she was just wearing her plain white blouse and black slacks. She smoothed her hair, suddenly self-conscious. People were starting to notice. A table near the piano stopped talking and looked at her. The room seemed to hold its breath. Nancy took a step toward the corner. Then another. The marble floor felt cold beneath her shoes. Every step felt heavier than the last, like she was walking through deep water. She was terrified of tripping, of turning back, of failing. But she kept walking. There was no turning back now. The challenge had been accepted. The deal was made. The walk to the corner of the room felt like the longest walk Nancy had ever taken in her life. She was used to rushing around with a heavy tray, weaving between tables with speed and precision. But now, without the tray, without the apron that served as her armor, she felt strangely light and terribly exposed. Her simple white blouse and black slacks felt plain compared to the silk dresses and tailored suits worn by the diners she passed. She could feel their eyes on her. At first, it was just a few glances, curious looks from the people nearest to table 12, wondering why the waitress was walking toward the stage area. But as she moved further away from the safety of the service station, more heads began to turn. The soft hum of conversation that usually filled the high-end restaurant began to change. It wasn't quiet yet, but the tone shifted. People sensed that something unusual was happening. Waiters stopped mid-pour to watch her. A businessman in the middle of a loud joke lowered his voice, distracted by the woman in the worn-out shoes making her way to the grand piano. Nancy kept her eyes fixed on the instrument, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. If she looked at them, she knew she would freeze. She would see the judgment, the confusion, and the question in their eyes. What does she think she's doing? When she finally reached the piano, the sheer size of it seemed to loom over her. It was a beautiful beast, polished to a high shine that reflected the golden light of the chandeliers above. The black lacquer was flawless. It looked terrifyingly perfect. Nancy stood in front of the bench, her hands trembling so much that she had to clasp them together to hide the shaking. The polished wood of the lid was open, revealing the strings inside, tight and precise, waiting to be struck. The keys were white and black, staring up at her like rows of silent teeth. For a terrifying moment, Nancy almost turned around. A voice in the back of her head was screaming at her to stop. "You are going to embarrass yourself," it said. "You are just a waitress. You don't belong here. These people will laugh." The silence that had fallen over the nearby section of the room felt heavy, pressing against her ears. It felt like the whole world was waiting for her to fail. She could feel the sweat trickling on her forehead, and her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure the people in the front row could hear it. She looked out toward the crowd. Her eyes scanned the room and found David. He was still standing near his table, his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was watching her with an intense, focused expression. He didn't look like he was expecting a joke. He looked like he was expecting a miracle. That look anchored her. He believed in her, for whatever reason. He had seen something in her tired eyes that she had forgotten was there. She couldn't let him down. More importantly, she couldn't let herself down. She remembered the $500 in her pocket, but that didn't matter anymore. This wasn't about the money now. It was about proving that the girl she used to be still existed somewhere inside the tired woman she had become. Nancy took a deep, shaky breath and lowered herself onto the bench. It was firm and cool against the back of her legs. She adjusted her position, inching forward until she was at the right distance. She felt small on the bench, a solitary figure in a vast, noisy room. The piano smelled like lemon polish and old wood, a smell that instantly transported her back 20 years. She placed her hands on her knees, trying to stop the trembling. She closed her eyes. This was the hardest part. Opening her eyes meant facing the reality of the restaurant. Closing her eyes meant facing the music. She took another breath, filling her lungs with the scented air of the dining room. She visualized the notes in her head. She wasn't thinking about scales or exercises. She was thinking about the one song that used to make everything else disappear. It was a piece by Chopin, one she had played 1,000 times in her mother's living room. It was a song that felt like crying and laughing at the same time. Slowly, with great hesitation, Nancy lifted her hands from her knees and hovered them over the keys. They looked old to her. The skin was a bit loose, the knuckles a bit swollen from years of labor. They were hands that had washed thousands of dishes and carried thousands of plates. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist. She felt a flash of shame. But then she flexed her fingers. She remembered the strength in them. She remembered the dexterity that used to be there. She lowered her right hand toward the lower register. Her pinky finger found the A key. It felt smooth and cool. She pressed down. The first note was a single, deep sound that rang out clear and resonant. It wasn't a mistake. The vibration traveled up through the key, into her finger, and up her arm. It was an electric shock. The sound of the piano in this room was far richer and louder than the old upright she remembered. It sang. The note hung in the air, silencing the last few whispers in the room. Nancy didn't freeze. She didn't panic. That single note acted like a key unlocking a door. Before she could talk herself out of it, her left hand found a chord, and her right hand began to move. The opening melody was slow, deliberate, and heavy. The first few measures were shaky. Her timing was a little off, and her fingers felt stiff and rusty, like a rusted hinge that hadn't been oiled in years. She winced internally, expecting the crowd to laugh or boo. But no sound came from the tables. The silence deepened. They were listening. Then, something incredible happened. As she moved into the second phrase of the melody, her muscle memory began to take over. Her brain stopped telling her what to do, and her hands just knew. The stiffness in her fingers began to melt away, replaced by a fluid, flowing motion. The rusty hinge disappeared, and the gears began to turn smoothly. The music began to swell. The simple, slow notes transformed into a cascading river of sound. The quiet hesitation was gone, replaced by a growing confidence. Nancy's posture on the bench changed. She wasn't hunched over, protecting herself. She sat up straighter, leaning into the instrument. Her eyes were still closed, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she was listening to a voice only she could hear. The physical world around her started to blur. The smell of the expensive food faded. The ache in her lower back vanished. The fear of the people watching her disappeared. There was only the music. It was pouring out of her, flowing through her veins and out of her fingertips. She was playing harder now, the bass notes thumping with a rhythmic heartbeat while the treble notes danced like light on water. She realized she was holding her breath, and she let it out in a long exhale, letting the tension leave her body. She was hitting notes she didn't even know she could still reach. Her fingers, which had been stiff and trembling just minutes ago, were flying across the keys with a speed and grace that shocked her. It felt like coming home after being lost for a very long time. The piano was no longer a stranger, it was an old friend she had neglected, forgiving her instantly and welcoming her back. The room was completely transfixed. A busboy stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, a stack of napkins in his hands, forgotten. A woman at a table near the front had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Even the clatter from the kitchen had ceased, as the staff had stopped working to listen to the sound coming from the dining room. It wasn't just a piano lesson, it was a performance full of soul and raw emotion. It was the sound of a woman who had put her dreams in a box for 30 years, finally opening the lid. Nancy opened her eyes, but she didn't see the room. She saw the notes. She saw the music in colors and shapes. She played a complex run of notes, her left hand crossing over her right, a daring move she hadn't attempted in ages. She nailed it. The sound soared up to the high ceiling, bouncing off the glass and wood, filling every corner of the space. She wasn't Nancy the waitress anymore. She wasn't the tired mother or the woman struggling to pay bills. She was a musician. And for the first time in a very long time, she was free. The music was taking her somewhere else, somewhere beautiful, and she was determined to take everyone there with her. The sound that filled the room was no longer just music, it was a living, breathing thing. It swelled and surged like a tidal wave, crashing against the walls and filling every empty space in the grand dining hall. Nancy's fingers were moving now with a speed and fluidity that shocked her. The stiffness she had feared was completely gone. In its place was a memory etched deep into her muscles, a pathway in her brain that had been dusty and unused for decades but was now lit up like a city at night. She was playing the Etude by Chopin, a piece she had practiced endlessly as a girl. It was a difficult song, full of rolling arpeggios and sudden changes in tempo. When she was 18, she had played it with aggression, trying to show off how fast she could go. But now, 30 years later, she played it differently. She didn't play to impress, she played to feel. Every note carried a weight, a story of the years she had spent in silence. The bass notes were heavy and deep, thumping like a heartbeat, while the high notes danced above them, light and airy, like birds flying over a storm. The crowd that had been curious just minutes ago was now absolutely paralyzed. It wasn't just that a waitress was playing, it was the quality of the sound. There was a raw, unpolished emotion in her playing that you couldn't learn in a conservatory. It was the sound of longing, of regret, and of a joy that had been suppressed for too long. People stopped eating their expensive steaks. Waiters froze in the middle of pouring wine, the liquid spilling over the rim of the glass unnoticed because they were too entranced by the melody coming from the corner. A young couple near the front, who had been bickering quietly about their bill, stopped talking. The man looked at his wife, and suddenly their argument seemed trivial. They both turned to look at the woman on the bench. Even the kitchen staff had ventured out from the swinging doors, standing in a row at the back, their white aprons stained with sauce, their eyes wide with wonder. The usually noisy kitchen was silent, the chefs listening to the melody drift through the air vents. Nancy felt the change in the room, but she didn't let it distract her. Instead, it fueled her. She could feel the energy of the audience pushing against her back, a wave of attention that lifted her up. She hit a series of rapid notes, her fingers blurring across the ivory keys. She felt a surge of adrenaline that she hadn't felt in years. It was better than coffee, it was better than rest. It was pure life flowing through her veins. She approached the difficult middle section of the piece. Her left hand had to play a steady, rhythmic pattern while her right hand jumped around the high register. In the past, this was the part where she used to get nervous and mess up. But tonight, her hands knew exactly what to do. It was as if the piano was guiding her. The instrument felt like an extension of her body. She wasn't thinking about which finger went where, she was just thinking about the shape of the sound, the way the harmony swirled and resolved. She remembered why she had loved this piece so much. It was sad, yes, but there was a fire in it too. It was about fighting through the sadness. It fit her perfectly. She thought about her mother, who had sold her own jewelry to buy Nancy that first cheap piano. She thought about the late nights practicing by candlelight because the power bill was too high. She thought about the day she had to sell her own piano to pay for her father's medicine. All that pain was pouring out of her now, turning into something beautiful. It wasn't just a song anymore, it was a conversation with her past self. She was telling that young girl that it was okay, that she hadn't forgotten, that she was still here. The sweat was dripping down her temples now, and her breathing was heavy, but she didn't stop. She felt powerful. She wasn't the invisible woman who cleared tables. She was the center of the universe. She had control. For these few minutes, she wasn't at the mercy of a manager or a customer or a bill collector. She was the master of this moment. The feeling was intoxicating. It made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. As the song raced toward its climax, Nancy opened her eyes for a moment. She saw the room full of people, but they weren't looking at her like a stranger anymore, they were looking at her with respect, with admiration, and with a kind of shared emotion. She saw David standing by his table, his hands resting on the back of his chair. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was staring at her with intensity, nodding slowly, as if to say, "Yes, that's it. That's who you are." She looked down at the keys again. The music was building to a crescendo, a roaring waterfall of sound. She put her whole body into it, swaying slightly with the rhythm, stomping on the pedal to sustain the notes. The sound was huge, filling the entire restaurant. It vibrated in the chests of the listeners. It felt like the roof was going to lift off. And then, as quickly as it had built up, the storm began to break. The fast, furious notes slowed down. The volume dropped from a roar to a murmur. The complex chords simplified into a gentle, lilting melody. The anger and the power of the song melted away into a deep, profound sadness. This was the most important part of the piece. It required a soft touch, a tenderness that was harder to achieve than the loud, fast parts. Nancy caressed the keys. She barely touched them, letting the sound linger in the air until it faded into nothingness. She played the final few notes, one by one, each one like a drop of water falling into a still pool. The last chord was simple and quiet. She held her hands above the keys, letting the vibration die out naturally, unwilling to break the spell by cutting it off. When the final sound disappeared into the silence of the room, Nancy let out a long, shuddering breath. She sat there for a moment, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She was exhausted, but she felt lighter than air. Her heart was pounding, but it was a good feeling, a feeling of being fully alive. She slowly pulled her hands back into her lap and waited for the noise of the world to return. She didn't know what to expect. Would they go back to eating? Would they laugh? She kept her head down, afraid to look up, afraid to see the magic break. But for those few minutes, she had touched the sky again. She had proved to herself that the music was still there, waiting for her to find it. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the restaurant remained completely silent. It was a heavy, thick silence, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that happens when something truly profound has just occurred, when people are so moved that they have forgotten how to speak. The last gentle vibration of the piano string had faded into the air, but the feeling of the music hung like a mist over the room. Nancy sat with her hands resting in her lap, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she caught her breath. She kept her eyes fixed on the keys, terrified to look up. She felt like she had just poured her entire soul out onto the floor, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to face the world again. She was expecting the normal noises to return instantly, the clinking of spoons, the low hum of resumes, the coughing and shuffling. But none of that came. Instead, a sound broke the silence that Nancy hadn't expected. It was the soft sound of someone sniffling, trying to hold back tears. Nancy slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were wide and wet. At the table closest to the piano, the woman who had been arguing earlier was now crying openly, a handkerchief pressed to her face. Her husband had his arm around her, looking at Nancy with a look of total disbelief. Next to them, a businessman in a sharp gray suit had taken off his glasses and was pinching the bridge of his nose, clearly fighting back emotion. It wasn't just one or two people, it was the whole front section. They were looking at her not as a waitress who had made a scene, but as a human being who had just shared something incredibly beautiful and painful. Then, David moved. He was standing by his table, and he didn't clap loudly or whistle. Instead, he placed his right hand firmly over his heart and gave her a slow, deep bow of respect. It was a gesture usually reserved for royalty or master artists. It said, "I honor what you have done." That single movement broke the dam. A young man near the back stood up and started clapping. Then a waiter joined in. Within seconds, the whole room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a thunderous roar. People were standing on their chairs, stomping their feet, and shouting. The sound was deafening, filling the high ceilings and bouncing off the walls. It was a wall of sound that hit Nancy like a physical wave. She sat there on the bench, stunned, tears streaming down her face, blurring her vision of the standing ovation. The kitchen staff, who had been watching from the service doors, rushed out. They weren't clapping politely, they were cheering and whistling, proud of one of their own. Her manager, a man who was usually stressed and shouting orders, was standing near the bar with his arms crossed, a huge, proud grin on his face. He wiped a tear from his own eye and gave Nancy a thumbs up. Nancy tried to wipe her face with the back of her hand, but the tears kept coming. She was overwhelmed. For 30 years, she had been invisible. She was the person who brought the food and cleared the mess. No one ever looked twice at her. Now, hundreds of eyes were fixed on her, cheering for her, seeing her. It was a moment of total validation. She felt a warm glow spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the adrenaline. It was the feeling of finally being recognized for who she truly was. The applause began to settle down slightly as people started to sit back down, but the energy in the room had changed completely. The atmosphere was warmer, more connected. The gap between the wealthy diners and the staff had been bridged, at least for a few minutes, by the power of the music. David walked over to the piano. He moved slowly through the crowd, who parted for him like water. He stopped in front of Nancy, who was still sitting on the bench, looking dazed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. It was far more than the 500 he had promised her. It was a large roll, enough to pay her rent for months. "You were right," David said softly, so only she could hear. It was rusty for maybe 10 seconds. After that, it was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. That wasn't a service, Nancy. That was a gift. Nancy looked at the money, then up at him. She shook her head slowly. "I can't take this," she whispered. The song was for me." I needed to play it more than you needed to hear it. David smiled kindly. And that is exactly why you deserve it. Please. Take it. Buy yourself a piano. Even a cheap one. Just promise me you won't wait another 30 years to let it sing. Nancy hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the money. Her hand closed around the thick roll of cash. It felt heavy, but it felt light at the same time. She didn't just see money, she saw a new set of tires, a paid electric bill, and yes, maybe a used piano sitting in her small living room. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she choked out. David offered her his hand to help her stand up. Nancy took it, and as she rose from the bench, she felt different. Her back didn't ache. Her feet didn't hurt. She stood taller than she had in years. She wasn't the tired waitress anymore. She was Nancy the musician. She knew she would have to put the apron back on eventually. She knew she would have to clear tables and wash dishes tomorrow. But something inside had shifted. The part of her that she thought was dead was awake now, and she knew she could never kill it again. She walked back through the restaurant, but this time she didn't look at the floor. She looked at the people. Some smiled at her, some nodded, others just looked with wonder. She walked with a grace that hadn't been there before. She retrieved her apron from the chair, but she didn't put it on right away. She held it in her hand as she walked toward the kitchen. The rest of her shift was a blur. No one complained about the service. People were extra kind, leaving tips that were bigger than usual. It seemed that her music had touched them so deeply that they wanted to share their good fortune with her. But the biggest change wasn't in the tips or the compliments. It was in Nancy. When she finally clocked out and walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air, she looked up at the sky. The city was noisy, cars honking and people rushing by, but she felt a strange sense of peace inside. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, clutching her coat and the roll of cash in her pocket. She hummed a few bars of the melody she had played, her voice mixing with the sounds of the street. She realized that life hadn't actually changed. She still had bills to pay. She still had to work hard. But she had changed. She had remembered that she wasn't just a worker. She was an artist. She had something to give. And as she started walking toward the bus stop, a small smile played on her lips. It wasn't the polite, fake smile she gave to customers. It was a real smile. She knew that somewhere out there, there was a piano with her name on it. And she couldn't wait to play it again. The music was back, and this time, it was here to stay.